Okay, here we've installed our D-type rubber sealing ring and our two O-rings there for the piston, the diaphragm spring, and then we talked about this is that this second section right here is going to be fed lubrication oil, and during the action of the clutch actually spinning, centrifugal force that would be working on trapped fluid between the piston and the drum is going to be counteracted by centrifugal force between this lubrication piston and the two sections of trapped fluid. As this drum is spinning, will balance the force and allow the diaphragm spring to just simply stroke back the apply piston and keep it in the release position. All right, now here we see our turbine shaft. Now this transmission is 16 years old, has well over 100,000 miles, but you can see that there is very little wear. And remember, we talked about this in the past with a mechanical system. It's kind of an analogy between a mechanical and electrical system. I'm just transmitting torque through this member. As long as I don't exceed the elastic limits of the material, this could last indefinitely. One thing that's interesting to note here in the last 20 years is the manufacturing techniques, these precision welds, and the stamping. Is the German engineering at its best. Now what we're going to do is go ahead and load our plates. Now Mercedes likes to use this little diaphragm spring, goes down against the apply piston, kind of acts as a cushion there as I apply the clutch. And of course, obviously, now you want to look carefully at how it's designed, but here, of course, the dish portion is forcing up, just like a saucer. And of course, I've marked it here so I can note. Oftentimes there's a witness mark, though, where it's been making contact with the piston, so it's pretty obvious. And then we'll go ahead and load the clutches. Here we have a steel. Here we have a friction. Now these, of course, are double-sided, and back, I guess, for the last 50 years, automatic transmission manufacturers have favored the double-sided frictions. But here we're seeing on this transmission is one example where I have clutches where one side will be a friction and the other side will be a steel. And, of course, inner and outer teeth, and it kind of has become popular with many manufacturers. Clutches look to be in good condition. And go ahead and load it up. Now, there's some schools of thought about soaking clutches, and you'll notice that what Robustus does is they'll pre-soak their clutches for you. But usually what we do here is that I don't normally soak clutches, and the logic is, well, what happens is as I start the vehicle, the forward clutch member is going to be released. I'm going to have transmission fluid circulating. It won't take long before it wets the clutches down real good. And of course, as I go for the initial road test, drive it gently. It won't take long before I get an ample flow of fluid and lubricate my clutches. Now on Mercedes, usually what they like to do is this taper side is down and flat side is up. But as you can see, the witness mark clearly indicates the opposite. So I'm going to go ahead and put it back together. As I took it apart, as far as I can tell, on this transmission had never been disassembled before. And again, what am I doing here? These are called witness marks, and usually what that does is it kind of testifies as to how this actually went in the drum. Whether the snap ring is right side up or upside down, I don't think makes any difference at all. This is considered a critical clearance, but normally to change this clearance I'd have selective snap rings, but these are usually hard to get. And normally, especially with the later electronically controlled transmissions, I have a considerable stroke of this piston, and it actually remembers, that is, the transmission control module actually remembers the fill rate of a clutch to get a desired apply, and allows me to be rather flexible there in the actual clearance. If it's too tight, of course I would drag. If it's way too loose, get a delayed engagement. But that's not so much of a problem on the late model units. All right, here we are. We're building up the unit. I've just rebuilt this. I'll be done if I've lubricated the bore that these Torlon style sealing rings are going to slip into. Here we see our stator support, turbine shaft bushing. It's in excellent condition. Here I have my Torrington bearing, and here the race is actually part of the drum itself. There's actually a hole in the bench that allows the turbine shaft to go through. So we're building up our unit. Now on the Mercedes units, as the 5, the 7, and the 9G-Tronic, you're not going to load the case from the front. You have to build up your gear train on the stator and pump and bell housing assembly, and I'm actually going to set the case on it. If you try and load it from the front, you'll notice that you're just almost impossible to get things aligned. Hey, you may do it that way, and you may have a magic technique, but here, this is much, much easier and much more reliable. Also, as I come down there, if I have absolutely no gap and I sit on the gasket, I know for sure that I haven't dropped a clutch. So, there we go. Okay, now, what we're looking at here is this is the B2 and the B3 clutch, and I actually have two pistons here. A common return spring. This has been cleaned up nicely. We're going to be replacing the O-rings right here in just a moment. And when I say O-ring and D-type ring, you'll notice that as I look at these rings, some of them actually look like a D. In other words, they have a flat side and a curved side. So this would be a D-type ring. And some of these rings are actually O-rings. So if you look at this one right here, is this D-type or O-ring? So this looks like D-type. And you'll notice that how I'm removing these is just simply with the gloves. These textured glove, D-type, and then D-type. Now this would be hard to do with your bare hands, but the gloves are textured, kind of like a, actually maybe the foot of a lizard. So it allows me to grip something that I normally couldn't grip with my bare hands. And also it protects your hands also. Even this one, see how I'm able to pull it out and pick it up? Boy, that'd be hard to do with your bare hands. Now this one's not D, this is just square cut. Now what they've done for me here in my Toledo kit is all of the O-rings for this assembly are nicely put in this bag. So it's showing me the B2 piston, B3 piston, everything is right here. Okay, here we see the B2 and the B3 clutch and pistons. Now, this housing right here is actually going to bolt to the case, and it's very important that this piston be in the correct alignment. Now, I haven't installed the spring yet, but as you can see, this is very easy to move, and it's been carefully marked on the disassembly. even with the spring in place, this still can be moved, just with a little more difficulty. Now, the return spring is actually going to go on the top right here. But here in the different piston cavities, this section right here has an air bleed, and there you can see the actual check ball. Now, this is not a spinning clutch. This is just acting as an air bleed. Now, it's very important that that air bleed be up there at the 12 o'clock position. And again, I mean, without putting the spring on, it's, very easy to move. Now, this is the spring retainer, and you'll notice that it has a notch right there that's forcing you to put this in the 12 o'clock position. Just make sure that you pay attention to that, that's all. All right, so now I'm getting ready to go over to the arbor press, and I'll just simply take and push this down. This is very easy to do. Just make sure it's aligned correctly, and then I'm going to put my snap ring in. Okay, here we have assembled our B3, B2 pistons, and the B2 clutch assembly is actually going to fit right in here. But here I see my check ball there at the 12 o'clock position. And of course, we talked about the way this is designed. I'm forced to put it in that position. The position of the snap ring doesn't make any difference, but I just happen to put it here. And there I have lined this up correctly. Now, this can actually be moved. It takes a little bit of force. In fact, actually, if you can tell, I did move it a little. But what happens is that this is going to index with the lugs in the case, and I want to make sure that my bolts line up. And by the way, when you put this together and you load it in the case, go ahead and check this and put your bolts back right away. Because if they're slightly off and you're not able to put it, just pull it out, and you can actually grab it with your hands and turn it if you have to, even after you've put this together. So you can do it. And of course, obviously, if it's at 180 degrees out of position, well, that's going to be kind of hard. You might want to go ahead and take loose the snap ring. But here, if it's very close, you can move it around. All right, now as far as air checking this, I have a special regulator on my air gun, so I have very, very low pressure. You wouldn't want to hit this with 150 pounds because you just do some serious damage. And of course, obviously, when you're doing air checking, normally you'll always have the clutches in there. But what I'm doing, I'm just checking to see if I get a little movement there. No problem there. We see the B2 piston coming up without any trouble. Here, this is actually going to the K3 clutch. And here we have the... Okay, now this section right here, if you can see this, is actually going to the check ball section. This is actually going to be the release section right here. There it goes. You can see the check ball come out. And then here we see the B3 piston, and there it comes up. Nice and good seal. I sure had a collection of O-rings and D-type seals. But they're all in there. I put the old ones back in the bag. Make sure we got them all in there. Now we're ready to continue putting it together. Okay, here I'm ready to load up the B2 clutch. Here I see my dish type apply ring right there. It's actually marked to denote the upside, but it's pretty obvious. I mean, you got a witness mark right there where it goes against the piston. And we'll go ahead and put this together. Now you'll notice that on some of these clutches, like for instance the B2 clutch, this normally isn't applied. This is kind of helping to provide overrun braking. And you'll notice that, interesting here, it looks like it doesn't get applied very often, and that's true. So normally there's very little wear. Notice something interesting here. It's a little different, doesn't really make any difference, but the friction clutches have the outside lugs and the steel clutches have the inside, which is doesn't make any difference really, but it's a little different from what they've been doing for the last 20 years. And of course we would call these I guess a double-sided friction. I have friction material on both sides. Just wipe them off a little, just inspecting. You wouldn't have to wipe them off. Some people actually soak them in transmission fluid. I think that's an extra step that's unnecessary. Now, as far as the flat side and the bevel side, usually the bevel side is always down, and I can see the witness mark where it made contact with the clutch. And you see what I mean? It doesn't look like that clutch ever actually slid across this, and I guess it didn't. And the reason why is because they both have outside lugs, so of course it never slid. It's always stationary. That's why I have that nice mark there. Now, sometimes I see it like this, sometimes I see it like this. I'm going to go ahead and put it back the way it was. And that was from Mercedes. This unit has never been disassembled before. And here I have my snap ring. It doesn't really make any difference which way the snap ring goes, but what happens is I can look at the witness mark to determine, hey, which side it had been installed. Okay, here we're doing a quick air check. Here we see our clutches. And we're just giving a little bit of shop air. The clutch is there retaining the piston so it doesn't get away from me. No problem there. This is going to be the little return section right here, and there I hear that check ball whistling. And what that does is actually going to push the B2 piston back. So that's what this is. This is not a spinning clutch, but I actually have a separate hydraulic passage that will help return that. And then, of course, here we see the B2 piston moving, and it does have its diaphragm spring. Now, the B3 piston, be extremely careful, because what happens, I don't have anything retraining it. The actual clutches are going to be in the case. So if I apply shop air here, you want to do it extremely gently. And here I got the very careful. This is a Vacula air gun, and it has a little throttle on it that I can control it pretty well, but also have the pressure regulated too. Don't bring it up too far. And it all's good. It's ready to go back in the case. Here I'm just doing a quick air check. Here I can check the B2 clutch. Here's the K3 clutch. It's good and tight. I can hear it apply. Here's a release for the B2. This is the B3. I don't want to do this because if I do, I don't have anything to retain it, but it would be squeezing this clutch back right here. And then I can go down here to the bottom right here and be checking these clutches too. So there we go. So we're good. And we're ready to go back together. Again, I'm going to assemble this part in the case, and then I'm going to lower the case onto the gear train. All right, now these are some very critical thrush shims. This is how Mercedes is going to adjust the in-play. This bearing design I think is very nice. Both ZF and Mercedes favor this. And what happens is these shims need to go between the inner race of the bearing and the parking gear. And you'll notice that the parking gear goes solidly against this seat. Now you don't want to lose those shims. You want to keep them together. And I'm going to go ahead and put the bearing back in the case and then assemble this part in the case. Make sure that your shims are carefully tacked into position with the assembly lube as I go ahead and lower this down onto the gear train. Okay, here's the transmission case, and one thing about doing a good rebuild, you want to clean things up nice. This is a small case, so it's not really hard to handle. Some of the larger truck transmissions, the case can be very muddy, very nasty. And what we actually do is, without taking the transmission apart, there is after it comes out of the vehicle, we'll actually scrape the mud and then blast the case with a pressure washer and hot water and detergent. And that really helps. Now we do have a washing machine, and we can put the case in the washing machine. I don't have a washing machine here at this site. I'm using the pressure washer But a smaller case like this, I actually blast it with compressed air, scrape it, blast it before I take it apart, and I try to do that to reduce the amount of material that I'm actually putting in the solvent tank. But here this case is nicely cleaned up. Now normally the case really doesn't have a wear surface. I mean, there's nothing on the case right here where I'm actually have any type of shaft or anything moving against. Now, why would a case get damaged? Well, I mean, something hit it from the side, some type of auto accident. On the 4MATIC units, sometimes, you know, like for instance, a drive shaft coming loose and hitting the case. Normally what happens if the guibo fails and the drive shaft flips around, it just misses the case. So a case, well, don't replace too many cases. Cases are pretty much one of those components that about the worst thing that can happen is a bolt get damaged or stripped. Sometimes what happens is if I have bolts where the threads are exposed to the elements, but that's not the case here. So this is our case, nice and clean, ready to go back together. Now, this is the Adapta case pry stick. Sometimes we call it the pixie stick. It's actually for working with snap rings in a case. And they say don't pry things with it, but I find it's just so nice for just getting up under a seal and picking it right up. Doesn't touch the case, barely deforms the seal. Now this is for the manual linkage. You don't normally replace this, but hey, on this one we're going to go through and put all the paper and rubber. And so we'll go ahead and select a nice socket that exactly fits this and gently push it down into the case. Okay, here we've assembled the parking pawl mechanism, the parking pawl bushing, fresh O-ring, replace the seal for the manual linkage. One thing you want to watch out for on Mercedes, a good overhaul can go bad by this bushing being wrung out or missing. And what the customer is going to feel is a very excessive looseness there in the manual linkage, all because this is missing or broken. And this actually is probably just a few cents. Now I buy these online and I pay a couple of dollars a piece for them, and they're probably marking them up 500% or 1,000%, but that's okay. Only costs a couple of dollars to have these in stock. Sometimes a little bit of a nuisance to get, and you need to plan for things like this, but you just buy, you know, 3, 4, 5 of them, maybe 10 of them. If you do a lot of automatic transmissions, they'll give you a discount. That can be a problem here on Mercedes. Okay, we've installed the bearing. Make sure it's in the correct direction. I don't think it really hurt anything. It's upside down, but usually the retainer is down. There's the snap ring. Now, we're getting ready to put in the parking gear, and here are the 2 shims that we stressed so much before. And I'm going to actually have to put this down and put the B3, B2 clutch assembly there on top of it. And I need to make sure that these are solidly retained. And what happens is I have a lube guard, assembly goo, and this is specifically for automatic transmissions, and this is the green, and as you can see it's very, very heavy, very, very thick. And when I glue something down with this, it stays put. Normally they say this is the summer mix and the blue is the winter mix, but I really prefer the blue, Smart Blend Blue, year-round, especially if I'm working with any rubber seal. I only really use the green for some very special application, such as this right here. It's very thick. And of course the idea is, you know, once you add transmission fluid and start up the vehicle, that this stuff will dissolve and just go into solution in the transmission fluid. But there in the meantime, it's going to do its job. These are the critical shims that we talked about, controlling thrust. And this is going to go up against the inner race of the bearing. And I'm actually ready to set this down in here. So we'll go ahead and set this down in the case. The parking pawl will index this parking gear. Now I'm ready to slide the B2, B3 clutch assembly You go get it off the gear train. Now normally this is a slip fit, and we talked about how important the alignment is, so I'm going to go ahead and slide this down. Now, one thing that I do have, and it's kind of a long story how I came across this, but I got a case of this stuff, silicone mold release, and you can use transmission fluid, that probably would be better, but if you just want, you know, to make something slide easily, there between aluminum, this works magic. Also, it uses refrigerant as the vehicle to discharge the silicone, so it actually has a tendency to cool the surface also. Okay, here I've set the B2, B3 brake housing here into the case. Now at this time you want to go ahead and install these bolts. Now it may be that they won't be perfectly in alignment, and actually the bolts will kind of pull it into alignment. If you aligned it correctly though, these will just start by hand and you can just run them in very easily. So here I'm going to take my speed handle, and if I have done this correctly, the threads will start no problem. Go a little evenly. Pull it right down. Here we go. I'm just going to set this over here. Loosen this guy back up. Finish putting this one down. Very easy, no problem. Now remember, if it's not perfectly in alignment, this is where you're going to pull it into alignment. Just be gentle, and whatever you do, don't damage those threads. So here we go. Now I'll go ahead and double check the torque as I put it together. But there we go. Now I've got to load the B3 clutches in the case, and then I'm going to be ready to set the case down on the gear train. Okay, here I'm ready to load the B3 clutches, and here we see the dish type apply spring, and again this has a pretty heavy dish on it, and just like looking at a dish, make sure that the dish type goes down. And I actually have clear witness marks where it made contact with the piston. That's really no question. Right, so. And then we have our steel. Now, it depends on how this vehicle was driven in its failure mode. Sometimes this clutch can get torn up a little, but this one looks like pretty good shape. And so here we go, loading the clutches. Now as I put the snap ring in, the snap ring, usually the opening of the snap ring goes to the 12 o'clock position. I don't think it would make that much difference. I probably want to keep it away from this area, but we'll go ahead and put the opening of the snap ring at the 12 o'clock position. That snap ring is not extremely stout or anything. It's pretty easy to handle. No problem. Right here we see the backing plate, and again they put the bevel side up. I'll leave it that way. I can clearly see the witness mark of the clutch and the snap ring. And here we can clearly see the witness marks of the snap ring's orientation as far as up or down, and I'm going to go ahead and put the gap there at the top. Okay, here I'm getting ready to lay the case down on the gear train, and this is the way you want to do it, assembling the 5G-Tronic, 7G-Tronic, and 9G-Tronic transmissions. And there are other transmissions too that this is the method of assembly. Now, I'm sure that at Mercedes they have a special jig that carefully aligns all these clutches, and I'm going to do the best I can here with my copper screwdriver. And then we're going to take this and lower it here on the gear train. Now what I've done is I've carefully lowered the case there on the gear train, and here I got lucky, fell down the first time. Now you can see it should move smoothly, lets me know I didn't drop a clutch. Everything came down together without any problem whatsoever. So we're in good shape. Okay, now we're ready to install our rear seal. Now you'll notice that I have a metal section and a rubber section. I actually lubricate this with assembly lube, and I'm just using this piece of plastic to drive it down. And it should slip right in. You want to keep it nice and level. Just give it a little tap, and in she goes. Now, here I'm getting ready to install my output yoke, so I'll go ahead and just slip that down into place. On some you will see a shim. There was not one here. The shims to establish thrust are normally between the bearing and the parking pole gear. Alright, so we'll just kind of lay this down, give it a little push, and she's in position. Now, what we're going to do is what I've done is I've cleaned this threads and this nut with brake clean, and I'm going to use a little bit of Loctite blue. Stay away from Loctite red. A little Loctite blue, that'll keep it from backing off. And I'm going to get my 30mm socket, 12 point. Now there's a specific torque on this, but what I like to do, I want to put it back where it was. So you'll notice that I can actually put the transmission in park here, and I can go ahead and get my wrench and crank it down. Now, sometimes what happens is I need to have a way to back that up. And this is one method. It's just a large adjustable wrench. Works pretty well. Now, what am I up to? And as I look, you'll notice what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to retighten it to the position where it was originally staked. And let's see if I can get back there. Now, I guess I could get the torque wrench out and try and retorque it, but remember, I'm putting back together something that had already been set up at Mercedes, so I'd kind of like to go back where they were. Almost. One little bit more, and I got it. Well, that last little bit's going to be a problem, so just get a gentle persuasion. There she goes, lined up perfectly. Okay, now we're getting ready to put the front pump together. And as you can see, is after I lowered the case onto the bell housing, I have two bolts here that Mercedes provides. And I go ahead and tighten these down, keeps it all together as I move it back over here to the assembly cart. Here I'm using my speed handle. You'll notice that from the factory, Mercedes puts a little bit of sealant there on these bolts. Freshening up that sealant wouldn't be a bad idea. And what I want to do is kind of very gently run these bolts in with the speed handle. Probably wouldn't be a real good idea to use the impact right here. And so what we'll do is go ahead and run all of these in here with the speed handle. Okay, here we have all our fasteners carefully torqued. I should be able to spin the turbine shaft without any problem. If I can't, that means I dropped the clutch. I should be able to spin the output shaft and the turbine shaft independently of each other, and they move very smoothly, no problem. And then, of course, obviously, I reach over here and put it in park. There we hear the parking pole indexing the parking gear. Now, the 5G-Tronic, 7G-Tronic, and 9G-Tronic transmissions are not super heavy. It's not like this is a big truck transmission. Fairly easy to handle. So what we've done is we've done the mechanical section. And one thing I mustn't forget here, while I'm here, let's go ahead and do it. Careful not to touch the housing right here, but let's go ahead and torque our B2, B3 clutch housing. Remember, we're going into aluminum. This isn't a head bolt, so torque here is measured in oftentimes inch-pounds. All right, that's ready to go. Now we're going to go ahead and clean up our valve body and finish putting it together. Now, as far as air checking is concerned, here it's very easy to check the B1, B2 back here. Okay, now some of these passages are not quite so easy to get into, and there's a couple of methods that we've developed